Through the rains of the deluge, a swarm of dots slowly made over the highway east along the Oraculon. They were quarry of a different sort, and Ludmilla idly mused over how things had turned out. The humans below were one of the many groups that had been encouraged to flee their homes by the beastmen, yet no beastmen traveled with them. Due to how the beastmen managed their livestock, very few adults lived past their mid-20s, and anyone deemed unhealthy and unfit were culled regardless of age. As a result, those that remained all traveled at the bare minimum speed that could be expected of healthy, young and fit humans. In terms of long-distance endurance, that was a good deal faster than many of the beastmen. Ludmilla's primary goal during the first few days of their eastern offensive was to shake up the warrior clan's impressive discipline and organization, allowing the different races to slowly segregate into waves based on their respective travel speeds as they ran for their lives. Irma and Na civilians could only cover about 20 kilometers in a day before falling over in exhaustion. Osela could do about 30. Humans could manage 40 kilometers if they went from sunup to sundown. Con, Lup and Gao went anywhere between 50 and 60. The first couple of days had been slow, as the flight matched the pace of the Na and Irma. Once her forces ran them to exhaustion, however, chaos finally took hold. The Oselo were overrun over the course of the afternoon, which brought her to the humans. The rest of the beastmen were far ahead, including the warrior clans, which had decided to preserve their fighting strength rather than defend a lost cause. Ludmilla descended toward the lead group of human refugees, wondering if she could convince them to stop. Even without the presence of their oppressors, they ran regardless for fear of the undead menace creeping up behind them. She had driven everyone into a thoroughly panicked flight, including the Draconic Kingdom's citizens, or at least the citizens who had their wits about them. "You can stop running now." A few heads turned to look around for whoever had spoken to them, but everyone continued to trudge along. She landed a few dozen meters in front of them, holding up a hand. "Good evening," she said. Out of the way, woman. The undead are right behind us." A man a full head taller than Ludmilla came straight at her, uncaring of her words. He bounced off of her like she was a tree and lay stunned on the ground. The throng behind him only seemed to take note of her as a terrain obstacle and flowed around. Ludmilla opened her mouth to speak again, then stopped. She didn't have time to talk to hundreds of thousands of people spread out across a 100-kilometer front. Olga and Raoul would have an even harder time of it. They needed to finish turning the humans around before they reached the lake, where the beastmen based in Corin on the lake had likely stationed lookouts. "Well, there's more than one way to do this." She looked up to where the ghostly figure of Psycho was observing from above. "Psycho, summon blood meat hulks 100 meters ahead of them. Chase these people back west." Cries of panic rose as 4 fleshy abominations rose in a line before the human wave. The entire mass of people abruptly changed direction like a flock of starlings, flowing around Ludmilla as they ran back up the highway again. She wasn't sure if she was allowed to smile or not. "Pass my orders on to the rest of the front," she said after she rejoined Psycho in the air. "Don't run them too hard. They should be safe so long as they keep going west." "What of the undead pushing eastward?" the Elder Lich asked. "Create gaps for the humans to flow through. Once they get far enough, they should realize that something doesn't add up, I hope. This should give us plenty of time to prepare for Corin on the lake." She turned her gaze to the city in question while Psycho relayed her instructions. Not much could be discerned through the rain aside from its vague outline along the lake. Hopefully, the army's reconnaissance would be able to provide a better idea of the city's condition as well as the posture of its defenders. "Our forces have received your orders, Captain," Psycho said. "Shall we begin organizing our forces for tonight?" "Yes," Ludmilla nodded. "How is Raoul doing down south?" "The head of the expected Beastman reinforcements has been eliminated at Fortune Pass," the Elder Lich told her. "The remainder will not be able to make it in time for the battle at Corin on the lake. Unless there are multiple groups of reinforcements coming out of the mountains further east," Ludmilla said. How the Beastmen warbands communicated between themselves was one of the things that wasn't well documented. Their reactions across the front indicated that they didn't use any means of instant communication, nor did their hunters appear to use pets like hawks or ravens to deliver information. Her best guess was that they used a system of runners, but that didn't describe when, where, why and how those runners were dispatched. Once they were certain they had turned all of the fleeing citizens around, Ludmilla and Psycho headed back west to River Garden. Several vessels were moored in the harbor, so it appeared that Queen Auricula's had already arrived. After swapping to her civilian garb, Ludmilla landed next to the colossal bloodstain in the main plaza where her pyramid of limbless beastman bodies once stood. The thing just happened to be right in front of the city hall. Lady Entema was extraordinarily efficient when it came to the Sorceress Kingdom's corpse collection efforts, or maybe she was so quick because she wanted fresh bodies to munch on. She recognized the squad of men who were stationed in front of the entrance as members of Haifat's garrison, and they saluted smartly at her approach. "Any problems in the city?" Ludmilla asked. "No, Captain," the sergeant answered. "The people that came to Orichalon mentioned that the city had been, decorated, but they might have been exaggerating. All I see are bloodstains. There must have been one heck of a battle in the square here, though." "We only caught their rearguard," Ludmilla said. "Most of the fighting has been in the countryside." "Is Her Majesty holding court at the moment?" "Yeah. Local representatives have been coming in and out for the last few hours. Just give me a minute and I'll have someone let the captain know you're here." "Leluvian, are you here?" "Yes, my lady. I've just arrived in the city, but I'm not sure where they decided to stick the general staff." "In an office in the city hall." "Great. I'm here to let Queen Auricula's know what's going on. I'll put together the materials for a presentation, my lady." After a short wait, Ludmilla was escorted into the city hall, where Leluvian and a group of elder liches met her on the way to the office's main hall. The space had been rearranged into a makeshift throne room, with the queen seated on a dais at the far end. Her court was much smaller than Ludmilla had last seen it, though that was probably to be expected with so many left behind to handle affairs in the West. "Hey." "Hi." "Hello." Clara, Leanne and Florine were seated on one side of the hall. Lord Tien was present at the Queen's shoulder. It seemed that the court was simply conducting mundane affairs, else the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation would have been asked to wait outside. Ludmilla made her way forward, lowering her head in a curtsy before the throne. The Queen was dressed in a dark dress that seemed to emphasize her slender figure, yet Ludmilla felt that she was wearing it for some other reason. "Welcome back, Baroness," Queen Auricula said. "Thank you, Your Majesty. We're setting up for the next offensive, so I've arrived to brief the court on its details." The Queen nodded. "Please do." Just as they had in Fallujah, the elder liches rolled a map out over the floor and started to place markers upon it. Since the last briefing, the front had lost its original shape. The forces under Olga still maintained their echelon-like configuration as they swept eastward. In the south, Raoul's forces had repositioned to keep the beastmen from entering the Orichalon reach. Ludmilla's forces coming up the center had divided into two parts. Those on the south side of the river had slowed down as they closed within a dozen kilometers of Corin on the lake. North of the river, however, they had already reached the shores of the lake. "This is the present disposition of our forces, as well as all known beastman forces. We've interdicted all river traffic, so the beastmen have been cut into two separate groups. As you can see here, the ones in the north have realized that crossing the Orichalon to join their allies at Corin on the lake is impossible, so they are now making haste to eastward. By the time we begin our assault, they will be a full day away from Corin on the lake." She nodded to the elder liches, who started advancing the markers. The city lay on the southwestern shores of the lake between its outlet and a major tributary. Traditionally, it made Corin on the lake a highly defensible fortress that was effectively immune to sieges due to its water access. The Sorceress Kingdom's royal army, however, had many ways to negate that advantage. After midnight, Ludmilla continued, "We will begin our assault. The forces on the south side of the river will begin to encircle the walls, staying outside of the defenders' range. The forces on the north side will march through the lake to the far side of the city. When our encirclement is nearly complete, we will attack the city through its port." "Nearly complete?" Marshal Zulu frowned. "Why not complete the encirclement before attacking?" "Because we do not mean to complete the encirclement at all," Ludmilla replied. "As with Rivergarden, we're leaving an avenue for retreat open to minimize damage to the city. The defenses of Corin on the lake are far more robust, so intense fighting within the city is sure to leave the place in ruins." Once again, Queen Auricula said, "We thank you for your consideration of our circumstances, but will they flee so readily? Your previous briefings have mentioned that Corin on the lake has become their center of power. Abandoning it will incur a hefty political cost. I can't deny that your majesty may be correct, Ludmilla said. They may indeed act outside of tactical prudence. In that situation, I can only say that the entire city is populated by beastmen, so any collateral damage will be to the city's infrastructure and not to your majesty's subjects. Figuring out how to break the wills of Lord-class beastmen was an ongoing study. Civilian ones were not much harder than the average beastman to deal with once one figured out who they were, but the lords of the warrior clans were much the same as martial nobles. They were the bastions of their people, and they would sooner die than break. So far, her success with them involved manipulating the circumstances of the theater so that they would err on the side of prudence or ignorance. Once they'd decided on something, they invariably dragged their people along. In the event that they run, Queen Auricula said, what then? Will it be the same as the north? In essence, yes, Ludmilla replied. There will be a bit of a gauntlet awaiting them, however. During the deluge, the bridges here and here are the only way to cross those rivers for 24 or so kilometers. We'll be holding the first bridge, so the beastmen are going to be going on a very long run. Is that necessary? The queen frowned. We expect a high percentage of warriors in Corin on the lake, your majesty. Letting them take the direct route to Eastwatch will see them rejoining the other half of their forces within 2 days. We'd like to cut them down to size before they reach the eastern border. It will minimize the number of raids against your borders after your lands have been completely reclaimed. We see. Marshal Zulu mentioned something about needing time to raise proper reconnaissance patrols that can work in conjunction with the undead. This is in consideration of that? Just so, your majesty. Also, there is one other possibility that we are wary of. What's that? Reinforcements. Queen Auricula's and her court were left blinking after her singular reply. Ludmilla cleared her throat, glancing at the area of the map past Eastwatch. Given the way we've conducted this campaign, she said, it stands to reason that the existential threat represented by the undead will elicit the requisite response. To be frank, your majesty, this occupation is the result of a migration. Most tribal migrations represent the dregs or losers of the territory that they came from. With that in mind, it is not unreasonable to believe that something much stronger may come out of the jungle to face the undead. Their ignorance of the beastman country worked to their disadvantage, in this case. Originally, Clara's efforts in the Draconic Kingdom were supposed to start just before the summer harvest, so Elishnish would have had a whole season to investigate the beastman side of things. The idea that something much stronger than the beastmen occupying the Draconic Kingdom appearing in response to the undead horde was seen as a welcome challenge by many members of the Royal Army's General Staff, but Ludmilla worried over how things might escalate. They knew too little about the world beyond the bubble created by the slain theocracy, and Ludmilla was now almost certain that it was purposely crafted that way. The faith of the Six centered around the realization of humanity's potential. But there was a stark difference between the version of the faith that Bohadan had brought with him a century previous and the one that dominated the theocracy of the present day. If she were to paraphrase it, the faith of the Six that Ludmilla was brought up with saw humanity as one race amongst many, one blessed with the potential to become great through generations of hard work and refinement. They did not have any particular biases against other races beyond what came naturally with territorial competition. Other humanoid races, such as elves or dwarves, were not treated much differently from humans themselves. According to what she could piece together, the faith of the Six in the theocracy had gone from human-centric to human supremacist. That shift in stance was reflected in nearly every facet of its society, from the views of its common folk to the official policies of its government. Even attitudes toward other humanoid races had taken a sour turn. Elves were subjected to chattel slavery and half-elves were seen as something between filthy mongrels and an affront to the purity of human existence. She wasn't sure why it was that way, but the fact that Sursana had descended in Erantal instead of the theocracy suggested that there was something very wrong going on. Whatever it was, the regional conditions cultivated by the theocracy's actions made for dismal diplomacy between races. Never mind their own diplomacy. They knew absolutely nothing about the beastmen's foreign relations aside from the predator-prey relationship that they had with the Draconic Kingdom. The Royal Army's General Staff didn't think much of it, and neither did the rest of the Royal Court, for that matter, but the beastmen's response to the appearance of the unstoppable undead horde could very well pull in whatever allies they had in an effort to quell what most of the world would consider a universal threat. It was exactly the sort of start to their diplomatic efforts in the southeast that they were doing everything to avoid. "This is the strongest that we have ever seen them," Queen Auricula said, "so we would hate to see something even stronger come along. Are your forces sufficient to stop a response of far greater magnitude than what our country is currently facing?" "It's difficult to say, Your Majesty," Ludmilla admitted. "Everyone knows that the variety of beastman that we face is generally stronger than humans, but we do not know how strong they can become. With how large their territory is, I wouldn't be strange if there are several exceptionally strong individuals present. Furthermore, a decisive response by the region may bring a coalition army of millions to the border. The existence of the Oraculon grants logistical capabilities that would otherwise be impossible." "That would be a calamity," the Queen frowned down at the map. "Events of that nature have a way of taking a life of their own and growing out of control." "I may be a bit late in asking," Ludmilla said, "but have any attempts at diplomacy been made with the Beastmen?" "Attempts, yes. Successful attempts, no. They seem adamant about their antagonism. Not even merchants can get through to them. They hadn't even seen any Beastman merchants. Not any that they could recognize, at any rate." "Well, it is not an avenue that is available to us at this point anyway," Ludmilla said. "I will see what I can do to mitigate any potential response." For the moment, she couldn't see any way out of it. If the two sides were composed of the living, they might grow weary and simply give up on the conflict after it became too costly to continue. With the undead, however, they wouldn't stop until the threat was destroyed because the undead normally didn't grant any quarter and would fight to the last zombie. "We will see how things look in a few days, then," Queen Auricula said. "As for current events, many have volunteered to assist the populations afflicted by the Beastman's administration of Lera to the population. They will tend to the citizens and help move them back from the front lines, though, at the rate you've been advancing, we could use more people." "I believe some people should come screaming in a day or so," Ludmilla said. "Screaming?" The Queen tilted her head curiously. "The Beastmen are running scared, but the citizens are similarly running scared. Rather than spending time we do not have to calm them down, we simply sent them running back in this direction. Your Majesty should have a few 100,000 extra hands to assist with the afflicted." "Sauril. I shall arrange for their reception, Your Majesty." The Minister of Public Health lowered her head. The briefing was concluded 30 minutes later, after a small round of questions by concerned ministers. Most of them asked about the condition of the land and its people, while a few had concerns over security. With the Draconic Kingdom's royal army reduced to a handful of experienced companies and the same numbers still in training, policing the country was already a challenge without random beastmen popping up. Outside the city hall, Ludmilla was joined by her friends and they took a stroll around the central plaza. Leanne eyed the huge bloodstain as they walked by. "With it raining so much," she said, "I gotta wonder how you made that." "It's where the corpses were piled for collection," Ludmilla replied. "Speaking of which, was there anything left by the time you got here?" "Nope. I went looking around for dismembered limbs to scare Florine with, but I couldn't find any." Florine rolled her eyes. They walked past several pavilions where food and sundries were being distributed to lines of citizens. It didn't seem like any of them were dwelling on the past, instead idly chatting about the work ahead of them as they awaited their turn. "Something doesn't add up here," Leanne said. "What do you think, Ludmilla?" "If it has to do with merchants, politics or anything else on that side of things," Ludmilla replied, "you're asking the wrong person. I haven't noted any logistical issues. It has more to do with running a territory. The Queen's promised all sorts of things and I cannot for the life of me figure out how she plans on doing most of it." "Didn't Clara's research note how extraordinarily productive the Draconic Kingdom was?" "Yeah, but that's with a functional population. The way it looks right now, a third of the people are going to be tied up looking after another third of the people while the remaining third are mostly apprentices and journeymen. I think they'll be all right." Leanne turned a dubious look at her. "How do you figure?" "A feeling," Ludmilla said. "I've spent weeks flying over the land and taking everything in, and I don't find any imminent issues surrounding their ability to support themselves." "The Draconic Kingdom may have one major issue brewing," Clara said. "I'm uncertain if you've noticed it yet." "All I see are issues," Leanne said. "Which one is it?" They made their way out of the plaza, following the main thoroughfare leading to River Garden's eastern gate. How do I put this?" Clarus said. How do the residential and urban arrangements in Warden's Vale compare to those in your county? They're a lot better, Leanne said. Ludmilla cheated though. Maybe, but why are they so much better? Because attracting tenants to her domain sucks. And why did she need tenants? Because she had a labor shortage, Leanne replied, then frowned. Oh, wow. That's right, Clara smirked. You've been focused on the royal court and the merchants, but, if the Draconic Kingdom refuses to utilize undead labor, the common folk are going to have tremendous bargaining power for the next generation or two. What changes those generations bring may end up being permanent. Was that what she did? Retain power relative to her subjects by consolidating undead labor under her house? At the time, the only thing on her mind was working with the new administration and securing labor for her depopulated domain. However, one might look back and claim that she was driven by greed or the desire for power. I don't know if it'll work like that here, Leanne said after a few moments. The people are fanatically loyal. It's more than a bit creepy. Our people are loyal, too, Florian said. Yeah, but they're loyal for understandable reasons. I'm not sure if they would be as loyal if things weren't going so well, never mind getting raided and eaten on the regular. What Clara suggests is probably happening, Ludmilla said. Queen Auricula's subjects are loyal to their sovereign, but that loyalty is defined by what they are. They're not charmed or coerced into being loyal no more than our subjects are, and they have desires and goals of their own. Her court seems more than aware of how that loyalty is framed, as well. You can see them preempting it in the incentives that they've been offering and the various initiatives that have been enacted. Many of those initiatives were unthinkable in the north. For instance, if a territory was depopulated by a demi-human raid in Riestais, either one or both of two things would happen. On the management side, they would actively seek migrants from the nearby urban centers. On the tenant side, it was an opportunity to redraw lines and consolidate titles, creating all sorts of tensions. In the Draconic Kingdom, however, the government simply said it's harem time. And everyone jumped on the polygamy wagon. There was no deliberation over land distribution, only an action with a result. Not only were the Draconic Kingdom's leadership and citizens extremely resilient, they were also extraordinarily flexible. That adaptability was likely one of the major cornerstones to the country's survival in such adverse circumstances. They reached the eastern gate of Rivergarden a few minutes later, and Ludmilla turned to face her friends. Were there any last-minute things to bring to my attention? She asked. Not that I can think of, Clarus said. After you push the beastmen out of the kingdom, most of the work will be on our end. Unless she gets that army of millions that she was talking about, Leanne said. Would that really happen? Florian frowned. Not right away, Ludmilla said, but it's entirely possible. I flew over the beastmen's territory with Elishnish the other day and it's huge. I'm pretty sure we didn't even get halfway and we still covered enough territory to engulf both Riestais and Baharuth at the same time. These raids that the Draconic Kingdom experiences are likely conducted by just the clans on the border. Does that mean diplomacy is actually possible? Florian said, it may be that the only ones who harbor the raider mindset are the beastmen on the border, and will have better luck dealing with those further inside the country. Florian's experience working with demi-humans in the forests around the Azalizia Mountains had broadened her perspective tremendously. The average person associated non-humans by race rather than their specific social groupings. It didn't make much sense, but if someone had a bad experience with a goblin, they would go for the rest of their lives hating all goblins. One could teleport a goblin from the other side of the continent in front of them and they would still blame that goblin for everything that all goblins had done. Once Elishnish gets back, Ludmilla said, we'll have a better idea of how things are over there. If anything, they'll be forced to talk because the undead will be preventing them from doing anything else here. I can already smell the rare resources they have stashed away in that jungle, Leanne said. Ludmilla snorted. Merchants truly were a breed of their own. One thing at a time, Leanne, she said. First, I have a city to conquer. 24th day, Middle Wind Month, 1 CE. 30 more warbands just arrived from the south, a runner said from the stairwell. Where should we send them? Elin Auerlai's people? Elin Renathar asked. No, Elengkor's clan from the southwest. Use some of the space set aside for Elin Auerlai. What else? More clans are coming in from all over the south. It's getting crowded out there. Keep using up Elin Owli's spots, Elin Renethor told the runner. The runner nodded and disappeared into the stairwell. Elin Renethor turned his attention back over the battlements, staring out into the darkness. Elin Owli will be furious when he arrives, Sage KHHSCHLR said from beside him. He's going to be forced to camp in the fields at this rate. Elin Owli isn't here. Elin Renethor didn't look away from the surroundings. Elengkor is. That applies to everyone else arriving, as well. We do not have the luxury of reserving accommodations as if we were entertaining visitors. The undead will attack before the morning. How do you know that? Because it's my job to know. He didn't bother explaining himself. In the future, if ever someone appeared before him and claimed to be a sage, he would keep them away from anything important, preferably far away. To be certain, KHHSCHLR's knowledge was vast, but she only applied that knowledge selectively. When they had first met, she impressed everyone she encountered, offering information and ideas from her travels that saw promise in their then still in planning conquest of the Draconic Kingdom. Combined with Kalilindratha, they seemed like the perfect combination. Now, however, she was practically useless. War was not her area of expertise and her inquisitive nature turned her into an obstacle more than anything else. The only reason why he allowed her to accompany him was to make sure she couldn't influence the warrior clans with her wisdom. A pitched battle was no place for radical, untested ideas based on loose threads of knowledge. For the sage's part, she appeared content with being exposed to important goings-on. Her attempts at being helpful were just something he had to suffer through. Elin Renethor. A female voice drew his attention to the stairwell again. Thurgakr. He gestured in welcome. Thank you for coming. I should really be down there with the other warriors. She lingered at the top of the stairs, her stance hesitant. Elin Renethor beckoned for her to come forward. I mean no slight, he said, but your role as an advisor is far more valuable to those conducting the defense of the city than having another warrior on the field. The clans have been fighting for weeks now, Thurgakr replied, so they should know as much as me, if not more, of the undead that showed themselves, perhaps. Reports suggest that the powerful undead you spoke of have finally appeared. Thurgakr visibly wilted at his words. Once again, he wondered about her experiences. She shared them with Elin Renethor and the other clan lords on multiple occasions, yet her demeanor continued to indicate that words alone were insufficient to describe everything she had experienced. How many? The young warrior asked. The reports come from groups that are too far apart to be spotting the same thing. They've mingled into the general throng of undead, so it's difficult to say how many there are. I haven't seen them do that before. Did the reports mention any elder liches flying around? I'm not sure. Elin Renethor looked back down the western road again. We've issued instructions to keep an eye out for what you've described, but the night serves as an ally of the undead in more ways than one. Spotting a flying individual cloaked in black in an overcast night sky was about as difficult as it sounded. The enemy appeared to understand the limitations of dark vision, though that may have been a given since undead had dark vision themselves. What they didn't have, however, was hunters, so how they puzzled out what their scouts were capable of detecting was a mystery. They will be destroyed as soon as they show themselves, Sage KHHSCHLR waved a dismissive paw. We have so many hunters defending this clanhold that mere elder liches stand no chance. It's not as if they fly up and greet you before blowing you up, Thurgakr's ear twitched. Every time they've struck, it's been completely by surprise. They're magic casters, the sage said, so they're probably using something like invisibility. Their tactics may have worked well against the civilian clans, but our hunters are more than good enough to detect their approach. Elin Renethor remained silent throughout the exchange. The two females did not get along at all. The fault lay almost entirely with Sage KHHSCHLR, who saw Thurgakr as someone who had stepped into her arena, which was knowledge. The younger Nar had information that the sage did not, so KHHSCHLR was feeling jealous, threatened, or both. It also didn't help that Thurgakr was from a family of Narkira that was known for its bards. Bards and sages were both recognized for their knowledge, but bards had a place in every tribe while sages were seen as eccentrics. Have they ever come low enough for warriors to strike at directly? He asked. No, Thurgakr replied, they let the undead on the ground do almost all of the fighting. The elder liches act like carrion birds, waiting for the opportunity to pick out choice morsels. During their invasion of the Draconic Kingdom, Elin Renethor had faced his fair share of magic casters. No matter how powerful they seemed, they ceased being a problem once he got his claws into them. Unlike human mages, however, the Elder Liches seemed wary enough that they wouldn't ever give his warriors the same chance. Generally, it was proper to respect a shrewd adversary, but, in this case, their behavior was annoying. After piecing together Thurgok's disjointed and confused accounts of the fighting in the west, Elin Renethor was fairly certain that the principal limitations that he had observed of other magic casters still applied to Elder Liches. Spells tended to be very specific and limited in their effect, and recovering mana wasn't anywhere near as quick as catching one's breath. Thus, a magic caster who presented a grave threat against small numbers was little more than a pest when they didn't have the time to act at their leisure. Instead of being a force unto themselves, they were striking opportunistically to maximize the effectiveness of the undead on the ground. It was those ground forces that were doing the majority of the work in their broad advance across the Draconic Kingdom. If the hunters could deal with the Elder Liches, it would turn the battle into a purely terrestrial one and simplify things significantly. Report. A runner's voice came up the stairwell before she came into sight. Undead have been spotted to the south and southwest. Which way are they going? Elin Renethor asked. They're coming straight toward the city. That should be the last of the withdrawing warbands, then. Are the undead moving to join the ones gathered west of the city? They're too far away to know for sure, the runner said, but the lords commanding the southern approaches think they may be trying to encircle us. That's a welcome bit of news, if so, Elin Renethor said. Welcome? Sage KHHSCHLR blinked. How is being encircled welcome? The boats we sent to the north bank never returned. We'll be trapped. The sage's worried tone rose with every phrase. He resisted the urge to sigh. After sitting in on weeks of strategic and tactical analysis, she still didn't understand something so simple. Even a novice tactician would immediately realize that the undead has erred, and only a fool interrupted an enemy in the midst of making a mistake. The strength of the undead advance has been in the sheer weight of their numbers, Elin Renethor told her. They are voluntarily spreading their lines thin by attempting an encirclement. We have hundreds of warbands present and they will be able to strike anywhere they please much more easily than if the undead had concentrated their forces. If necessary, we can easily break through. He turned his attention back to the runner. The undead have been free to do as they please, but no more. It's about time they fought an enemy with real teeth. We're going on the offensive. What? Both Thurgok and the runner jumped at KHHSCHLR's near shriek. Tell Elin Kim to let the undead perform their encirclement, Elin Renethor continued. When their lines are drawn thin, tear them apart. Understood, Elin Renethor. The runner left. Elin Renethor leaned out over the battlements, shouting down to the lords below. Ready the warbands. We bring the battle to the enemy. Tens of thousands of warriors roused as orders sounded along the walls and over the field. They gathered into their respective warbands, their snarls and roars of anticipation sounding over the incessant rain. Your people are attacking, too? Thurgok asked. That depends, Elin Renethor answered. The undead forces in the west may respond to Elin Kim's sortie to the south, so I'm moving my forces to keep them in check. Going by what we've seen so far, they may not care at all or arbitrarily respond despite the threat presented to them. Our enemies are sluggish in thought and reaction, so many opportunities should present themselves to those with the will and courage to seize the initiative. Despite their steady advance, he still felt that the undead were lacking in several significant aspects. Perhaps it was due to their nature. The vast majority of their adversaries were mindless and their tactics were simple. Their strategy revolved around consuming what lay ahead of them like a teeming wave of vermin. Whatever intellect directed them seemed devoid of individuality and ingenuity. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that any intelligence within the undead forces was exercised in service to the voracious will of the whole. They were more a force of nature than anything else, and their behavior was just as single-minded as any elemental spirit. Just as a fire elemental sought to consume anything that would burn in its flames, the undead sought to consume the living. Elin Renethor came down out of the tower to join the rear of his army and, one by one, the leaders of each clan reported their readiness. To the south, he could already hear Elin Kim sounding his advance. Advance to within 3 kilometers of the undead in the west. His voice cut through the downpour, "Be ready to move if they do." 50,000 beastman warriors marched into the darkness, trampling the fields of spring grain. Runners came in every few minutes, reporting the findings of each clan's scouts. As expected, the undead hadn't reacted to their maneuvers yet. Advance to 1 kilometer. Hunters can go ahead and start skirmishing. Each runner that came in went back out with his new instructions. He was too far to hear it, but he could imagine the tens of thousands of bullets whistling through the rain. Over their weeks of testing the undead across the front, his force's tactics had been refined to the point of being reliable routines. Aside from a handful of reports, all the enemies before them were familiar, and he was confident that breaking the undead forces in the coming battle would be the beginning of the end for them. In a way, he was glad for their appearance. The conquest of the Draconic Kingdom had been unexpectedly lacking in the way of challenges, and they had far too many migrants to support. Sage KHHSCHLR's proposal to accommodate them by crossing the sea felt reckless, at best. Now, they would be able to properly consolidate their gains without a food crisis looming over their heads. With victory over their dread foe in hand, they could even retain the confidence of the migrants and their supporters in Rolengork despite the loss of the Warmaster. Elin Renither, the skirmishers are reporting a fog forming in the west. We're not sure if our ranged attacks are hitting anything or not. He craned his neck to see over the warbands ahead of him, but it was still too dark to register anything beyond the range of his dark vision. Are the undead doing anything? As far as we can tell, they're still inside somewhere. The fog is slowly traveling east. Against the wind? It seems that the undead have a new trick, or maybe they've been keeping it in reserve for something like this. Is there some sort of spell that does that? He asked one of his nearby mystics. Yes, she nodded. The second-tier spell Fog Cloud. It should only affect a small area, however. Elin Renither looked at the runner. It's across the entire field, the runner said. That should be impossible, the mystic furrowed her brow. How wide is this fog bank, exactly? Fog Cloud has a set radius, so we may be able to estimate how many enemy casters there are. I'm not sure. All we know is that it's covering the area where the undead are. How large is this set radius? Elin Renither asked. Roughly 12 meters across. Only 12? If that's the case. Cease skirmishing. He ordered. Hunters, keep an eye on the skies. We're pulling back. The undead line in the west was at least a kilometer across. 100 elder liches were far more problematic than the handful of potential sightings that were reported. Were there hundreds of elder liches when you came from the northwest? Not that I saw, Thurgok replied. There were always at least a couple flying around where I was, though. The fog bank may also be the result of multiple casts of fog cloud, the mystic added. Our skirmishers aren't going to be hitting anything regardless, Elin Renither said. There's no reason to put them at risk blindly flinging stones into that. They withdrew half a kilometer, waiting to see if the undead would come out. He sent a few people to see whether Elin Kim was encountering the same magic. Report. A voice came from behind him. Report from the city. The undead have appeared on the far side. The far side as in east of the walls? That's right. The defenders in the city are asking for instructions. Since the undead were coming from the west, the east side of the city was poorly defended. Moreover, how the undead had appeared there was an even greater concern. What type of undead were spotted? Elin Renither asked. The same as usual, the runner answered. They're not going very fast, so we don't expect them to connect with the other end of the encirclement for an hour or two. Speaking of which, do you know how Elin Kim is doing? He went all out, I think. You could hear the fighting all the way from the southern wall. Elin Renither nodded. At least the part was going as planned. As long as they kept the undead separated and manageable, all they had to do was wait until Elin Kim finished his front and pivoted to join the next. Take the defenders on the southern wall and send them to reinforce the east. Move the forces on the western wall to the port. The port? Those undead in the east had to have come from the water, Elin Renither said. If they enter the port through the river, the civilians will be slaughtered. Oh, and if you see anyone reporting from Elin Kim's side, tell him to come west when he's done. This fog is perfect for setting up a pincer attack. The runner went on his way. Thurgok looked up at him. Even with so many undead, she said, you're so calm. It does no one any good if a lord panics, he told her. We're far from a pitched battle, besides. His forces maintained an orderly withdrawal before the fog, crossing back over the former 3-kilometer mark. The rain receded to a drizzle, allowing the sounds of distant battle to finally reach their ears. Elin Kim doesn't sound very close, he said. I hope my runners got to him. Something's going on in the city, one of the fresh runners waiting to deliver orders said. Something as in fighting? Frolicking? It just started. Fighting. Panic. Elin Reneth appeared toward the still distant wall, waiting for a sign from the people stationed on the towers. A torch appeared a minute later, creating a point of light that waved back and forth. Well, damn, he said. We're pulling back. There's trouble inside the city. He was halfway through dividing his forces between defending the wall and helping out in the city when a cow landed on a nearby warband with a thump. That was a cow, right? Sage KHHSCHLR asked. Elin Reneth looked up into the pitch darkness. What was the angle on that? He shouted. Came in from straight above. Came the reply, it's an undead beast. Fog. Falling cows. What was next? A sturgeon smacked into the ground in front of them. The warriors around it stared as it flopped around. It flopped its way over to the nearest group, then tried to bite a curious osalo that came closer to inspect it. An assortment of zombified animals started to rain from the sky. Elin Reneth shook his head. Spread out and get moving. He told them, cover the mystics. The rearmost warbands broke from the rest and ran for the gate. Elin Reneth and his retinue joined them. By the time they got to the city, civilians were rushing in every direction, carrying children and what few belongings they could. He grabbed a female lup by the shoulder and spun her around to face him. What's going on here? The undead are in the city. They got past the warriors in the port like they were nothing. A shriek sounded from a nearby alley. An osalo stumbled out, nearly falling on his face before dashing away in fright. Behind him, undead Nar shambled out of a nearby alley. Elin Reneth's warriors pounced on the thing, then dispersed to search for more while directing the fleeing citizens to the city gate. What do they look like? Thurga grasped the lup still under Elin Reneth's paw. Look? Like human warriors, maybe? But they're as tall as us. I saw one cut through 3 warriors in a single stroke. Elin Reneth released the civilian, who dashed past the arriving warriors without another word. His gaze went to Sage KHHSCHLR. Stay out of the fighting, he told her. We need to contain this before it gets any worse. They left the sage behind. Thurgak's steps grew hesitant as more civilians ran by and the clash of battle drew near. That's probably them, she said. The ones I spoke about. I couldn't even tell how strong they were. Do they have any weaknesses? Elin Renea asked. They're not all the same. I saw 2 types, one armored from head to toe, the other was in lighter armor, something like tattered hides. The lightly armored one had all sorts of weapons. It's probably the one she mentioned cutting through multiple warriors at a time. He turned to address his warband. You heard her, he said. Pick off the lightly armored ones first. Get rid of everything as quickly as possible or we're going to be caught between their 2 forces. Another group of civilians ran by. A dull metallic tread sounded from around the corner. Go, he commanded his warband. Thurgak, go with KHHSCHLR. You clearly haven't gotten over your experiences yet. His warriors rushed forward. An unearthly howl sounded, echoing off of the buildings on either side. Elin Reneth ran in just behind his warriors, finding a monstrosity of black armor barring their way. Behind them was a more lightly armored undead figure. That one first. He called out, take it down, quick. Harden your defenses. If it could cut 3 warriors down with a single stroke, it would be the most powerful undead yet. His retinue did as instructed, going wide around the first undead's undulating blade. A few steps later, they all turned to face the first undead. Snap out of it. Elin Reneth roared. The warriors turned away and started to move again. The undead prepared to lunge at one of them, but Elin Reneth let out a roar of challenge. Don't think you're the only one that can taunt, he said as he stepped back from the shield that swung toward him in response. Beyond his adversary, one of his warriors was cut in half at the waist. 3 more took advantage of the opening to score telling blows that shredded its light armor apart. Elin Renethor nodded to himself, then batted aside a thrust from his opponent. Huh? The thrust reversed into a draw cut. He caught the blade in his claws. It's weak? Not that it was genuinely weak, but, for all of its imposing appearance, it didn't have the power behind its strikes to match. He used his free arm to slash at the undead warrior, imbuing the attack with several martial arts. Claws on metal screeched as it brought its shield up to block his attack. Elin Renethor released the sword and stepped lightly to the side as it tried to bull rush him. Offensively, it's weak. Defensively, I've never seen anything like it. No, that wasn't right. One of Khalil Indratha's assassins was fairly close. This undead creature was surely an invincible foe against lesser opponents, but against those closer to its caliber, the flaws of focusing on defense were clear. Another unearthly howl filled the air as Elin Renethor stepped back from a set of furious swings. Reinforced hide felt sufficient to stop even its strongest attacks. With that in mind, he went on the offensive. Ability boost, focus battle aura, sundering strikes. Chips flew from sword and shield as he unleashed a barrage of powerful slashes. The first thing he needed to do was shatter his opponent's shell. The undead's counterattacks came predictably, and Elin Renethor came out of the exchange unharmed. He didn't pause, however, leaping back in to draw a furrow through the metal of one of the undead being's black bracers, then crossing over to ring its helmet. He snorted as the thing only grew more furious. At least there was a bit of personality in there. A powerful overhand swing put a paw-sized dent in the tower shield, and then Elin Renethor jerked as a black bolt buried itself in his shoulder. He avoided the next set of the shield-bearer's attacks while looking around, blood soaking the fur of his arm. Past his opponent, dozens of bodies and body parts littered the street. His entire warband was dead. It had barely been a minute. Sibilant whispers slithered through the air. A dark glow washed over his opponent, and Elin Renethor's eyes narrowed as he watched what damage he had inflicted reverse itself. Another dark figure appeared further down the street, followed by several more. Just how many of these things are there? A low growl filled his throat. If there were so many powerful undead, what was the point of all the skirmishing the undead forces had suffered so far? So much time that they could have used to advance, so many undead destroyed, for what? Unless they were testing us the entire time. For the first time that night, Elin Renethor felt a cold sliver of fear piercing the depths of his being. Behind the horrors standing before him was something far worse. The Elder Liches, whatever these things were, they were merely pieces to put into play. A malevolent will look down on their struggles as nothing more than knowledge to be gleaned, observing, experimenting. One that gave nothing, while at the same time taking everything.